It was the Parthians who annihilated a 40,000 strong Roman army at Carrhae and slew Marcus Crassus, a co-ruler of Rome alongside Caesar and Pompey. Yet Iran's greatest epic, the Shahnameh, which recounts the nation's history in such exhaustive detail that it took decades to compose, allots the Parthian Empire merely 27 lines. And these were the people who, for 5 centuries, held the frontier along the Euphrates, the line where legion after legion was shattered, and Rome could never break them. How did an empire that Rome itself dreaded end up erased from memory, almost without a trace? And who erased it? Its enemies or its own people? To grasp where Parthia even originated, we must return to the day Alexander the Great died and his colossal empire burst apart at the seams. The east fell to the Greeks, to the Seleucid dynasty, the heirs of Alexander's generals. But holding a realm that stretched from the Mediterranean to India proved impossible. By the mid-3rd century BC, the Seleucids began losing their hold on the far northeast, bogged down in endless wars against Ptolemaic Egypt in the west. And precisely at this moment, out of the steppe came the Parni, a nomadic tribe and distant relatives of the Scythians. This was not a civilization or a kingdom, but a free people of the grasslands, with almost no hierarchy. Archaeologists excavate their graves and cannot distinguish a chieftain from an ordinary warrior, because they were buried identically. Every man was a warrior, and other social classes barely existed. It was this very trait that made them both dangerous and utterly unexpected contenders for an empire. Their leaders, the brothers Arsacid and Tiridates, invaded a region called Parthia, a narrow strip of land in the northeast of modern Iran, and killed Andragoras, the Seleucid governor who had risen in revolt. In 247 BC they founded a dynasty. From then on, every Parthian king assumed the name Arsacid upon ascending the throne, just as every Roman emperor would later take the name Caesar. That is why we know many of the early kings only by this throne name, while their personal names are lost. The forgetting of Parthia, in a sense, began with the Parthians themselves. But to the people of these lands, the Parni were outsiders. The local population, descendants of the Persians, were Zoroastrians. They worshipped fire, preserved the memory of the great Achaemenid Empire, and viewed the steppe as a land of darkness, the source of all evil. And the Parni came from that very steppe, worshipping many gods, which to a Zoroastrian made them little better than pagans. The settled Iranians met their new masters with hostility. The sources mention uprisings and clashes between the newcomers and the conquered population. Remember this rift between the steppe kings and the Persians they ruled, because 500 years later, it is what will erase the Parthians from the memory of their own heirs. The Seleucids, of course, tried to crush these upstarts. And here the Parni showed for the first time the tactic that would define them for the next 5 centuries. Instead of standing and dying against a powerful army, they would abandon their own land, retreat into the steppe to their allied nomads, lure the enemy deep, and then come crashing down on a foe stretched thin and bled dry. The Seleucid king Seleucus Sivan marched east, certain of an easy victory, and was utterly defeated. Hints in the sources suggest he was even taken prisoner. So this handful of steppe people did not merely defend their right to exist. They grasped the key insight. A vast regular army can be destroyed without ever meeting it in a head-on fight. The nomads had carved out a kingdom. But a kingdom is not yet an empire. To become a power that would make Rome itself shudder, the Parthians lacked 2 things: a weapon the civilized world had never seen, and a man with the nerve to wield it. This man was named Mithridates I, and his very name, given by Mithra, the god who grants royal power, seemed to promise greatness. He inherited a small kingdom on the edge of the ancient world and left behind a world empire. He conquered Media, then invaded Mesopotamia and took ancient Babylon and Seleucia on the Tigris, one of the largest cities in the entire Hellenistic world, a rival to Alexandria itself. He captured the Seleucid king Demetrius and treated him with an almost mocking kindness. He married his prisoner to his own daughter, caught him twice trying to escape, and finally, as a joke, gave him golden dice, a child's toy, to scold him for his childish recklessness. And so, a state that had recently been nothing more than a steppe raid now spoke to the heirs of Alexander as an equal, and over their heads. The weapon the Parni had been missing was their army, and it was like nothing else in the world of its time. It had no infantry at all, only cavalry of two kinds. Most were light horse archers, masters of the bow, who on principle refused to be drawn into close combat where the Roman infantry was strong. And the core, the fist of the army, were the cataphracts, riders in which both man and horse were sheathed from head to hoof in scale plate armor, a living iron battering ram. There were few of them, and they were kept in reserve. The combination of the archers' elusive speed and the crushing charge of the cataphracts. Against this, a world of heavy infantry and Greek phalanxes simply had no ready answer. It is striking that the armor for the finest cavalry of antiquity was, according to recent excavations, forged in the workshops of the Merv Osis, in the very heart of Parthia. And the money came from geography. Parthia lay directly across the Great Silk Road, the main trade artery between Europe and Asia. Through it, from west to east and back, flowed silk, incense, and jewels. The tolls filled the royal treasury, and along the routes, cities grew and grew rich. Ctesiphon, Hatra, Merv, Dura, Europos. Parthia became a living bridge between the two halves of the known world, and that wealth fed its armies. And here lies a paradox that matters for our whole story. In public, the Parthian king and his nobles played the part of stern Eastern rulers in Persian robes, following the ancient ceremony of the Achaemenids. But behind palace doors, everything was different. The nobility spoke Greek, changed into Greek clothing, dined reclining in the Hellenic style, and ordered statues of the gods from the finest workshops of hostile Antioch and neutral Alexandria. In the treasury of their capital, Nisa, archaeologists found Greek wine rhytons and heads of Aphrodite indistinguishable from those of the Mediterranean. The Parthian king himself, by tradition, spent his leisure hours watching the tragedies of Euripides. These people left their mark everywhere. It was the Parthians who introduced into architecture the vaulted hall, the Iwan, and the dome, the very silhouette recognized today in any Iranian mosque. Their traces are everywhere. Their name is forgotten. Under the next great king, Mithridates II, Parthia stretched wider still, and for the first time in history, its border met the border of a new power rising in the West Rome. At first, their interests even aligned, and the Parthians sent envoys to the Romans. But the Roman commander Sulla received them with contempt, as something lesser, unworthy of being treated as equals. Rome did not yet understand who it was dealing with. Before long, a Roman historian would admit with bitterness that the Parthians had all but split the world in half with Rome and held the entire East. Rome had never yet met a power that looked it straight in the eye. Their first clash would become the most shameful defeat Rome had suffered in a generation, and it would all begin with the vanity of one very rich old man. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus, and he was the richest man in Rome. He was part of the triumvirate, ruling the republic together with Julius Caesar and Pompey. But he was the only one of the three without any great military glory of his own. Caesar was conquering Gaul, Pompey had conquered the East, and Crassus was simply very rich, and it burned him. Starving for a general's fame, in the year 54 BC, no longer a young man, he invaded Parthia against the will of the Senate, dreaming of repeating the campaign of Alexander. With him, he led about 40,000 men, 4,000 of them cavalry. In the spring of 53 BC, the Romans reached the city of Carrhae in the southeast of modern Turkey, an open, sun-scorched plain that might have been made for cavalry. Against them stood a Parthian general from the noble house of Surena, with a mere handful of riders, about 10 Zalozan horse archers and roughly 4 Zalozan cataphracts, less than a quarter of the Roman army. The legions locked into their famous testudo, a wall of shields on every side, and the Parthian archers circled around them and began to rain down arrows without coming a single step closer. The Romans waited for the steppe warriors to run out of arrows so they could force a close fight. But Surena had thought of everything. An endless line of camels kept the archers supplied with fresh quivers. The arrows never ran out. And whenever the Romans charged, the Parthians would wheel their horses and break into a feigned retreat, and at a full gallop, twisting back over the horses' haunches. They kept striking their pursuers without missing. This move would enter history forever under the name the Parthian shot. Crassus's son, Publius, was lured forward with a separate detachment, cut off from his own, surrounded, and killed. His severed head was raised on a spear and carried before the ranks to break his father in front of the whole army. About half of the Roman army was left lying on that plain. Crassus himself was killed during negotiations for a truce. And what came next is something the Romans would retell with a shudder for centuries. By tradition, the Parthians, mocking his legendary greed, poured molten gold down the dead Crassus's throat with the words, "All your life you thirsted for gold, so now drink your fill." But the most horrifying humiliation was still to come, and it was not bloody, but symbolic. Crassus' severed head was brought to the court of the Parthian king. And at that very hour, the king was watching a Greek tragedy, the Bacchae of Euripides. At one point in the play, a prop head of the torn, apart King Pentheus is carried onto the stage. And in its place, the actor lifted the real, still, fresh head of the Roman triumvir. The hall burst into applause. The head of the richest and one of the 3 most powerful men of Rome, used as a stage prop on a stage at the court of yesterday's steppe nomads, set to a Greek tragedy. Think about what this was. A complete mirror, image inversion of every story the West is used to telling about itself. The invincible Roman legion, the pride of the art of war, crushed completely by a people from the steppe whom the history books would later simply erase from memory. Rome had never been so humiliated. You might think the road west was now open, that Parthia was about to pour into Roman Syria and beyond. But instead, something far stranger than any victory began, a war 500 years long in which no one was destined to win. Carrhae did not break Rome. Rome does not break that way. In Rome, the defeat was seen not as proof of Parthian superiority, but as the result of Crassus's stupidity in underestimating the enemy. They learned their lessons from the disaster. They began to pay more attention to cavalry, and they came back. And so began what would repeat for centuries, swinging back and forth like a pendulum. Mark Antony, that same Antony, comrade of Caesar and lover of Cleopatra, led 100,000 men east through Armenia. He let himself drift too far from his supply train, and the Parthians destroyed his siege engines, then chased his retreating army, raining arrows on it at every stage of the march. Antony left more than 35 Zalozan soldiers behind in those sands. What the generals could not achieve by force, Augustus later won through patience and diplomacy. He negotiated the return of the standards captured from Crassus to Rome. The battle eagles were sacred, and their return was celebrated as a great victory. a victory that had never happened on a battlefield. From there, this war stretched on for centuries. The Emperor Trajan, at the peak of Roman power, fought his way all the way to the Persian Gulf, took the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, and declared Mesopotamia a Roman province. At that moment, the empire reached its largest size in all its history. And immediately, the instant he turned back, a revolt blazed up behind him. The defiant fortress of Hatra held out against him, and Trajan himself fell ill and died on the way home, never securing what he had conquered. Half a century later, under Marcus Aurelius, the legions took Ctesiphon again, and a plague drove them out of the captured city. A plague the retreating soldiers then spread across the whole empire. Another generation later, Septimius Severus took Ctesiphon a third time, and in this lies the whole pattern of this strange war. Rome captured the Parthian capital again and again, 3 times, and not once could it hold it, because both empires were simply too vast and too strong for one to swallow the other. Rome could not occupy and hold the boundless east beyond the Euphrates. Parthia could not drive Rome out of the Mediterranean. And every time one side seemed to be winning, the other found the strength to strike back. And the border, like a string pulled taut and released, snapped back to the river Euphrates. 5 centuries of unbroken hostility, and the front line had barely moved at all. But no one bleeds for 500 years without consequences. And when Parthia finally fell, the last blow was struck not by Rome, but by its own house. By the end of its history, Parthia was worn down from 2 sides at once, by endless wars with Rome on the outside, and by the chronic non-stop infighting of the Arsacid hairs on the inside. Kings replaced one another, sometimes at war with each other all at the same time. Meanwhile, the empire was crumbling into a patchwork of semi-independent principalities whose rulers obeyed the King of Kings in word only. That same loose, decentralized order, which had once let the Parthians rule a realm of many peoples with a light hand, in the end turned against them. In the year 216 AD, the Roman Emperor Caracalla, insulted by a refusal to give him the king's daughter in marriage, invaded Parthia, ravaged its lands, and desecrated the tombs of the Parthian kings at Arbela. Fate, however, mocked him too. Caracalla would be killed near that very Carrhae, the city of Rome's greatest disgrace. His successor, Macrinus, lost the last great battle to the Parthians at Nisibis in the year 217. 3 days of slaughter, with the victory going to Parthia, and he bought his way out with gold. And so Parthia won its very last war with Rome. It went on beating Rome right to the end. And barely 10 years later, the empire fell. But not under the assault of Rome, which had failed to defeat it in 5 centuries. It fell from within, from the region of Persis in southern Iran, from the very land from which Cyrus and Darius had once come. There rose a man named Ardashir, a Persian. He overthrew the last Arsacid, and in the year 224 AD, the Parthian Empire was no more. And here is the answer to the forgetting. Ardashir and his dynasty, the Sasanians, were Persians to the marrow of their bones. And they despised the Parthians as steppe impostors, outsiders who had sat for almost 5 centuries on the throne of true Persia. The Sasanians did something quite deliberate. They rewrote the past itself. In their official version of history, Iran jumped straight from the ancient Achaemenids, from Cyrus and Darius, directly to them, the Sasanians, as if the 5 centuries of Parthia between them had simply never existed. The Parthians were not defeated in memory, they were wiped out of it. That is why Iran's greatest epic, the Shahnameh, gave an empire almost 5 centuries long exactly 27 contemptuous lines about anarchy and lawlessness. The erasure worked so cleanly that it holds to this day. And yet, wiping them out completely did not work. The very Persian word Pahlavan, a champion, a knight, a hero, is an echo of the Parthians' own name for themselves, a pallav. The Iwans and the domes, the silhouette of every Iranian mosque. That is their architecture. The Parthian shot lives on in the languages of the very peoples they fought. They lost their own name, but they survived in the very bones of the culture that erased them. And in this lies the bitterest irony of Parthia's fate. The empire that the mightiest power of the West could not conquer in 500 years of war was in the end wiped off the face of the earth, not by an enemy. It was wiped out by its own heirs. And these heirs would not just inherit from the Parthians. They would surpass them. They would take the Parthian cavalry, the Parthian tactics, the very same capital at Ctesiphon, and bring it all crashing down on Rome with a fury the Parthians themselves never dared. Where Parthia held Rome to a draw for 5 centuries, the Sasanians would go all in. They would bring one Roman emperor to his knees and take another alive as a prisoner. The only time in all of Rome's history, the forgotten empire would give birth to the one Rome would never forget. But that is a different story altogether.